Welcome to our event today on ride sharing and autonomous vehicles. And welcome to those of you who are watching on our webcasting. My name is Ted Gayer. I am the Vice President and Director of Economic Studies here at Brookings. This is the first of what I hope will be many events hosted by our new Center on Regulation and Markets. The center, which I direct, and which includes experts from different disciplines across Brookings, will strive to inform and improve policymaking by providing scholarly work on regulatory performance and process and the efficient and equitable function of economic markets. I'm excited about starting this center, especially given its opportune timing. Regulations are critical for safeguarding our health, safety, and economic well-being, but if not done well, they can impose costs on consumers and businesses, and they can impede innovation. With the Republicans in the majority in the House and Senate, and with the incoming Trump administration motivated towards deregulation, 2017 will likely see some substantial changes in particular regulations as well as the regulatory process more broadly. I look forward to our new center providing dispassionate analysis and diverse views to contribute to this debate. The plan for today's event is to start with two research presentations. The first by my colleague Cliff Winston, who is the Searle Freedom Trust Senior Fellow at Brookings, is on his new research on the congestion reduction benefits of autonomous vehicles, a paper he's co-authored with Quentin Carpello of Yale University. Following Cliff, we will hear from Bob Hahn, who is a non-resident Senior Fellow at Brookings, as well as the Director of Economics and a professor at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at the University of Oxford. Bob will present a recently released paper on the consumer benefits from ride sharing. Bob's paper, it should be noted, in addition to being co-authored by Steve Levitt and Bob Metcalf at the University of Chicago, also is co-authored by Peter Cohn and Jonathan Hall, who both work at Uber. Bob, however, did not receive compensation from Uber for this research. In addition, it turns out, an Uber employee is a member of what's called the Brookings Society, a forum for Brookings to engage with young professionals. But Uber does not support the work of the Center on Regulation and Markets. Following the two presentations, I will moderate a panel discussion with Cliff and Bob, joined by Emily Kalinsky-Morris and Kenneth Leonard. Emily is the chief economist at Ford Motor Company, and Ken is the director of Intelligent Transportation Systems Joint Program Office at the Department of Transportation. We will follow the panel with a keynote speech by Congressman Earl Blumenauer, moderated by my colleague Amy Liu, who's the vice president and director of Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and so now I welcome Cliff to the stage to give his presentation. Thank you.
Is this up?
Yeah.
This guy?
Yeah.
Or this guy?
Or there. I would use this arrow. Autonomous. There you go. Yeah, it's voice activated. This arrow will advance. Right.
This advances. Oh, okay. Trust but verify. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ted, for inviting me to be part of this. I want to unpackage my title to clarify exactly what I'm doing, because I have a number of goals. The first part, can markets address government failure? Okay, that's the center part of this enterprise. We had a center a number of years ago that was led by Bob Hahn and Bob Lighton. And I would say if there was any theme, at least to my participation in that, it was market failure versus government failure, okay? I'll tell you the outcome of that shortly. But to be on the more positive side, I'm now looking at things, well, can markets address government failure? All right, so that's going to be one theme, at least of my research from the center. And I'll use autonomous vehicles illustrate that point, but certainly at some point later in the center I'll do more. Now, on the autonomous vehicles part, this will be certainly a research paper, but the broader concern that I have is my field of specialization, transportation economics, and this represents really a nice illustration of the broader impacts of transportation on the U.S. economy. For too long, people think of transportation as just a very narrow sector of interest of its own and do not see the broader, bigger picture of what transportation really means for the economy. And so I think with the introduction of autonomous vehicles, one will be able to get that insight. So I'm sort of sandwiching two goals, using autonomous vehicles to do that, right? All right, now the first part then on microeconomics and government intervention, and at least part of what the center is going to do. Okay, government, and sorry, I'm going to have to go fast to achieve dense communication. Government has two microeconomic objectives in intervening in economic life. First is to correct market failures, okay? So you have an inefficient outcome, and the failures I've listed there, market power. Actually, it's not market power isn't a market failure, it's illegal pursuit of market power or achieving such. Natural monopoly, it's technological characteristic where it's socially desirable to have one firm serve the market. Imperfect information, externalities, and public goods, public production. So these are motivations from government interventions, and this is an efficiency, an economic efficiency motivation, okay? The second objective is social goals, all right? So it's not an efficiency problem, but society as a political/social decision does not like the distributional outcome of certain events. People have, let's say, few skills, and they have low marginal products, and they get paid low wages if, in fact, payment is efficient based on marginal products. Society doesn't like that. They're going to intervene and say, look, you need to have a reasonable standard of living, and we're going to raise your wages, all right? So it's not an efficiency concern. It's a social goal. This is going to come back. What we want to do here, though, is an economic objective, is achieve those things at minimum cost. Okay, so those are the two things that government does in microeconomic life. And in my book, Government Failure versus Market Failure, coming out of the first center, if you will, I had evidence that government rarely achieves those objectives, and looking at all the academic empirical evidence that I surveyed, okay? So I want to turn around and say, okay, well, maybe markets could be helpful in correcting government failures, all right? So usually how we think about markets, usually we think they're the culprit and government has to correct market failures. But in fact, there's reason over time, if one's patient, that you can think about markets and their evolution, since they have incentives to do so and they innovate, that they might be able to correct government failures, all right? So let's look at the highway system, and this is where autonomous vehicles is going to come in. Okay, there are many problems with government regulation, if you will, and ownership and management of the highway system, growing congestion, crumbling pavement, structural deficient bridges, so on and so forth. All of these are reflections of inefficient policies. That's what they have to do with inefficient pricing, inefficient investment, inefficient production, regulations, misallocation of funds, so on and so forth. All these things are government failures. Those are your problems, all right? If we address those, then we would make a lot of progress in addressing the observables in terms of the difficulties with congestion and so on and so forth, okay? But that's not what we do. The policy mindset is to increase infrastructure spending. Both presidential candidates mentioned that, okay? But that's really not going to do the job. You're going to be putting money already in an inefficient system. I don't believe that you're going to get nothing for it, but you're still not going to be addressing the fundamental problems, all right? So the question I'm asking is, well, perhaps the private sector could help, all right? Now, I'm not saying privatization of the highway system. That will be for another day, but maybe on the modal side. All right, so the idea here is that modes lead infrastructure. This has always been true, like forever, all right? Well, maybe forever. Modes have improved their performance regardless of the state of the infrastructure, right? We had cars actually before we had highways. We had airplanes before we had airports. We had airplanes before we had air traffic control, all right? And you sort of look at all the improvements that the modes have made in technological advance, and you compare that with the infrastructure, it's night and day. Modes continue to come along. And the latest innovation is autonomous vehicles, right? The potential to prevent collisions, reduce regular and incident delays. Incident delays are, when there's like a crash and stuff, and then people stop and rubberneck, and things take forever to get out. Autonomous vehicles won't do that. Autonomous vehicles just keep going along. They're not going to look on the side of the road and see what happened. And that accounts for about a third of delays. So that's intuitively a reason where autonomous vehicles are going to reduce delays. Okay, so they're going to create a much smoother traffic flow. Okay, reducing congestion. Now the benefits depend on how many autonomous vehicles are out there. 50% penetration, that is 50% of the cars are autonomous that are out there, could reduce delays as much as 50% according to estimates in the engineering literature. And the estimates there are annual benefits to travelers of $200 billion. Now, my interest, though, as I said, is in transportation economics. The broader effects on the economy, how much can the economy-wide benefits be? And that's what my research was about. Okay, so I'm going to measure the broader effects to the benefits of the economy. I have a basic model here. I guess I'm told that when you have an equation, it reduces your audience by half, right? I guess I would argue that for every equation, you increase the motivation for privatizing schools. The relationship is the growth rate of economic performance. So I'm going to have some sort of growth rate variable, employment, trade flows, wages, GDP, is just a simple function of congestion. Intuitively, you can think about, congestion certainly can affect employment because your job search is going to be much less. Takes you 2 hours to get to work, it's going to be much harder for you to get a job, and you're going to look in a much narrower area where you might get a bad match, not to mention your own productivity and so on and so forth. So you reduce the cost of transportation, you could increase your job search, that'll be a good thing. Trade flows, the trade costs are going to go up for congestion, so on and so forth. So it's intuitive as to why congestion would be having these broader effects, and this is sort of what we call a reduced form relationship. Now, the question is, well, are we really going to get a causal effect? Can I really say that congestion's causing these things? Because unobserved factors that affect congestion are undoubtedly going to affect my performance variable, okay? And it's these unobserved things that really could be driving everything, right? So this is the standard stuff. The New England Journal of Medicine says, watching TV shortens your life, right? Well, it's the unobservables probably that cause you to watch a lot of TV, and those same unobservables that shorten your life that are really doing the trick, all right? So that's really the idea. You never can believe anything you read in the New England Journal of Medicine, by the way. Another matter, another day. All right, so the idea is getting the causal relationship, and so this is quote the science of what we're trying to do here, and estimating a causal relationship using what we call an instrument that purges these unobservables, okay, and then enables you to get a clean relationship between the variable you care about and what things it's causing. So I want to get a clean effect of congestion on these performance variables. And what I do is I use what we call natural experiments in the form of legislation to pass self-help county taxes. You're probably not aware of these. I wasn't until I got into this. But certain counties in America have the option to put legislation forward for people to vote on that would increase the sales tax by a small amount. You can use the money for transportation. Okay, so improving any part of the transportation system. Now, it turns out, though, these things are completely politically driven. All right, these things sort of be independent of macroeconomic forces and local forces, and it really is about mobilization and just getting political support for this thing. So the core of the paper goes into doing that. And so that can make, a plausible instrument. Now, even if there's any science that I go through this, it really is ultimately an art. You have to tell a story to do this, okay? So if you want to be deep and really critical, you can always go around saying, your instrument isn't plausibly exogenous. That's about it. Your instrument is not plausibly exogenous. It means you're not going to get a causal relationship. If you do this enough, then you will become the next Chauncey Gardner. Tough crowd. Chauncey, Chauncey for younger people. Gardner with an I. You guys must be in a bad mood still because of the election. I'm a bleeding heart libertarian. I see benefits on either end. All right, so the core of the paper goes through self-help county taxes and their exogeneity and justifies then my causal relationship. I will now move on. I use that then to estimate the effect of congestion on wages, employment, trade flows, and GDP for California counties. And then I use these estimated parameters to see the effects of reducing congestion. So I see congestion's effect on these performance variables, and I say, okay, if I reduce congestion, right, from autonomous vehicles, what gains am I going to get in terms of improving these performance variables? All right, so the rest of you now can tune out. No. All right, this is basically just an accounting relationship. All I'm doing is I'm estimating beta, that is the effect of congestion on my growth rate variables, and then I want to isolate then what the effect is of introducing autonomous vehicles, and in the end I get an equation that enables me to do that. That is, the post-growth rate will then be an expression in terms of the current growth rate raised to some exponential. Again, my beta I've already estimated, no problem there. The alpha then is what I'm assuming the effect of autonomous vehicles have on reducing congestion. So if I use this 50% assumption, I plug that in. I'm assuming 50% reduction, that's going to be the effect. All right, I could use other things too for sensitivity. Here's what I wind up getting. Big effects in California on jobs, improvements in employment, 300,000 plus, 35 billion GDP, wages, 14 billion, so on and so forth. The individual effects on counties are not particularly big, but there's just an awful lot of it, a lot of congestion. And when you start aggregating this up, you start getting big effects. The bigger numbers come in nationally, and you start seeing, if I expanded the results of California to the rest of the country, and even if I say, well, California is unusually congested, so let me just take 80% of the gains, I see huge improvements. Jobs, 2.4 billion, GDP, 213 billion, earnings, 90 billion. These are big macro effects. No matter how you spin it, I could even assume the alpha a quarter. It's still going to be a large effect, way beyond what you normally think that micro policies can do, saying, this is really a very promising technology. And those of you who are familiar with Bob Gordon saying, look, we're not going to have the kind of innovations that change society, not according to this. Okay. So autonomous vehicles then are effectively addressing the government failure by significantly reducing congestion. I argued earlier, if we had efficient micro policies, congestion pricing and the like, that could do it, but that's not what we have. So the private sector's coming in, helping. Benefits are substantial. I see the government's role is to just expedite the introduction of this. I don't want them micromanaging the transition. After all, if anything, they're going to learn from the private sector about what this technology is about. They should just be good listeners. I think autonomous vehicles are going to perform much better on highways that perform efficiently, so there's still a role for improving the highway system. And as I said, for another day, that may be if highways are privatized. The end.
Good morning. Thank you. Not right now. Thanks, Ted, for that great introduction. I want to start out with a question following off of Chauncey Gardner. How many of you have heard of William Francis Sutton? Don't worry, he's not going to be on the test. So, great American bank robber William Francis Sutton, a.k.a. Willie Sutton, a.k.a. Slick Willie, long before Slick Willie may have come to Washington, D.C., was being interviewed, or the story as has it, was being interviewed by a journalist. Now, Sutton lived from approximately 1901 to 1980, had an illustrious career, for about 40 years, was in and outside of prison, escaped from prison 3 times. So the journalist, figuring out what to ask William Sutton, says, okay, Mr. Sutton, why do you rob banks? So thinks about it for a minute. He goes, I don't know, because that's where the money is. Well, you could imagine a similar journalist in this day and age asking an economist the question, why do you study demand or demand curves? And I might answer, I don't know, because that's where the money is, at least somewhat under the curve, the area under the curve. And I think it will also, in the case of the application I'm about to talk with you about for the next 10 minutes, might give us some insight into what I loosely refer to as the ride-sharing revolution. So I'm going to talk about some joint work, as Ted mentioned, with a couple of folks at the University of Chicago, Mr. Freakonomics, Steve Levitt, and my frequent co-author, Rob Metcalf, and a couple of people from Uber as well. We were interested in trying to understand and estimate some of the benefits that might accrue to individuals that take use Uber as a service or use similar services like Lyft, though our data was from Uber. And we were interested in it for 2 reasons. One, or I was interested in it for 2 reasons. One, because I wanted to know whether it was a big or a small number, because firms, upstart firms, I guess it's not an upstart firm anymore, like Uber, face quite a bit of resistance in many places around the world. So are consumers getting a lot of benefits for this? And the second reason was more academic, along the lines of that equation, those equations that Cliff was showing you earlier. We don't really have a lot of good estimates, precise estimates out there of demand curves, particularly outside of the supply and demand point of equilibrium that you see. And we, as I will explain shortly, thought we had a nice experiment so we could tease out what this demand curve looked like. So that's the basic problem. I'm going to talk a little bit about what our approach was to addressing this problem, give you a very quick summary of results. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about them in the Q&A if you want. To the extent there are implications for autonomous vehicles, I will speculate about that, and then I will briefly conclude. All right, so this is a picture that may be on the test or may have been on your test in micro from 10 or 20 years ago or whenever you might have taken microeconomics. But it's a standard demand curve and supply curve, the demand curve being downward sloping as a function of quantity. You charge a higher price for ice cream cones. People demand fewer ice cream cones. We were interested in estimating just the demand curve for Uber services over a period of time in 2015 so we could get at that shaded area, which I've abbreviated consumer surplus. And consumer surplus represents the difference between what someone is willing to pay for a good and what they actually pay. And we use that, we integrate that area and get a measure of consumer benefits. So as I mentioned, these demand curves are pretty easy to draw. I spend my life drawing them at Oxford in introductory courses. But they're not so easy to estimate out there in the real world. So I want to talk a little bit about our estimation procedure. And just to warm you up, I didn't want to put an equation on the board like Cliff did, because I figured you'd be asleep by now. Instead, I want to talk about hockey. How many people are familiar with the book that Malcolm Gladwell wrote, Outliers? Great, great, great. So he talked about the Beatles, and he talked about Bill Gates, and may have talked about Robert Oppenheimer, I don't remember. But he also he had a vignette about hockey based on a study that this guy, Roger Barnsley, did. And the gist of the insight about hockey was that kids who were born in a certain month may have a higher probability of getting into the National Hockey League or being elevated to the next group than kids who were born in another month. Now, why was that the case? That kids in January had a better advantage or were more likely in some sense to get to the NHL than kids who were born in December? Well, if you were the oldest boy or girl in a league, and I don't know if the study was mixed sex or just for boys, if you were the biggest kid in the league, say you were born in January, you were much more likely to be able to trounce the little kids independent of your ability. So that was really what the story was about. But the point was that a small change in one's birth date can lead to you being put in what you can think of as a different treatment group. Like in this case, are you put in with the younger age kids or the older age kids? And that gave this social scientist an opportunity to tease out what the effect of this treatment was. So we used a very similar idea in a completely different context. Now, how many of you can I see a show of hands, how many people use Uber or Lyft or some similar service? Great, everybody knows what it is. So this is what, if you tuned in to Uber or Lyft, Uber a couple of years ago and brought it up on your app, and they had a period of intense demand or short supply, they might say they're going to charge you twice the base rate. And unbeknownst to you, they have given you a number, which is the reason the 2.0 comes out here. They give you an actual number to several significant digits, your surge number, and either round it down or round it up depending on what that number is. And that enabled us, in a way that I'll be able to explain to you shortly, to estimate a point on the demand curve. So what we did is we estimated several points on a demand curve with 50 million observations, which we might think of as big data. We used people's purchase rate when they faced a certain price, like 2.0 times the base price or whatever, as a way of teasing out the demand curve. And we exploited information on people who both accepted the offer at 2.0 and people who rejected the offer. And we use that information to then estimate the benefits, which I abbreviate as consumer surplus, as I said before, using the difference between willingness to pay and the price. So how did we do this? So I'm not putting up equations, but I am putting up nasty pictures here. So everyone to the left of the vertical red line was facing a surge price of 1.2, and their purchase rate was roughly 58%. Everyone to the right of the 1.25 red line, the vertical red line, was facing a surge price of 1.3. So people very close to that red line who had a surge number which they didn't see, let's say of 1.24, would have been rounded down and get a price of 1.2x. And people just above that surge price of 1.25, say it was 1.26, would see a surge price of 1.3x. And this gave us an opportunity to figure out what the price responsiveness was at about that point, 1.25. And when we did that and waved our hands in certain ways that economists are prone to do, we got something that looked like a demand curve. So that was the nature of our exercise, and I'm going to just, in the interest of time, move on to what our results are. The first result is we studied 4 cities, only 4 cities, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and LA. And our best estimate for 2015 of the benefits enjoyed by Uber customers was on the order of $3 billion. If you ramp that up, simply just do a calculation based on population in the U.S. where such ride sharing is available, you get a number like $7 billion. Is that a big number or a small number? I don't know. When Willie Sutton was robbing banks, he got about $2 million over his 40-year stint, which was real money during his time. You can decide whether it's real money now. What I do know is that, roughly speaking, for about every dollar that an average individual spent on Uber in the year 2015, they got about $1.60 in surplus back, at least based on our estimates. So what does this tell us for autonomous vehicles? Well, not as much as I would like. We don't know a lot about the impact of autonomous cars because there aren't a lot of them out there. And so here's some hunches. One which Cliff talked about briefly is that these vehicles may reduce congestion. On the other hand, if we use them a lot more, even if the cars are spaced closer together, it's not completely obvious that they will do so. But I'll say that's a potential benefit of having. Certainly, you can get more of these vehicles on the road, as Cliff pointed out in his paper, with a given level of congestion. But we have the downside, at least in transition, that there are a lot of Uber drivers, and I think there were 500,000 in Jonathan's. Jonathan had a figure, which I'm not going to put up. But there are a lot of people who are in business doing this stuff in the United States and around the world. They're probably going to lose their jobs as we move to autonomous vehicles, and obviously the wages that go with it. There may be a temporary depression in their wages. I think there's going to be a huge increase in consumer surplus, and people are essentially going to be able to do whatever they want in these vehicles. Cliff talks a little bit about this. I think indirect employment will rise as a result, and productivity will rise. There are also some big issues, which I know some of you are working on now. One related to barriers to entry, even before we get to autonomous cars, and a second related to sorting out liability issues. So let me stop there, and thank you. Oh, wait. Sorry, I got one more slide. Didn't realize that. Okay, so what did my application show? Sorry, Ted, this can just take a minute. Okay. First, how big data could be used to develop a demand curve. Second, there are significant benefits to ride sharing, certainly for those folks who use the service. Third, unrelated to this talk directly, it's my impression that both business and governments are sitting on a treasure trove of information and have only scratched the surface in terms of measuring the benefits of things like these Uber services. And I sit on a commission on evidence-based policy, which is aimed at unlocking some of that information for academics. And finally, I believe that the social benefits of autonomous vehicles are likely to be substantial. I would even say huge. But we need to think very carefully about the losers in this transition. Okay, this time it's for real, Ted. Okay, thank you.
Good? Oh. Okay, well, I think while they get mic'd up, I took initiative and tried to put it on myself. He can tell me how I did it wrong. I'm going to get started. Thank you again, everyone, for being here, and thank you to our presenters. I think as they were talking, I had a little midlife crisis. I feel like maybe because I'm solidly now middle age, or maybe because my oldest son is an adolescent, just entering adolescence, I feel like I'm the techno-pessimist of the group a little bit, and so I'd like to flesh some of that out first with our two presenters, and then I'm going to open it up to our two additional panelists. Thank you. I did mess it up, didn't I? I was so tempted to start with Cliff's first comment being your instrument isn't plausibly exogenous, but I don't know who Chauncey Gardner is, so I didn't want to risk it. So he can fill me in later. But I'm going to set this up for both Bob and Cliff my first question on a well-known study, I think getting a lot of attention in economics, called the China Shock by a number of authors, including David Autor. And the China Shock paper looks at local communities that were exposed to something transformative, in this case, trade from China, and saw pretty substantial labor market impacts over a pretty substantial amount of time. So I'm a kind of card-carrying economist, and gains from trade lead to positive net benefits with some transition costs of people who are dislocated based on their job compositions. And in this case, it was eye-opening about how large those transition costs could come. So that's my motivation, kind of approaching these whenever we have something which potentially, and this question here could be transformative, what are the implications or what are the downsides? And Bob referred to this on his slide. He had a driver's lost wages and jobs with a negative sign, meaning a bad thing on that. So let me just start with Bob. Bob, I love the paper. The paper is a very clever way, and that diagram, that regression discontinuity diagram, I think is beautiful. It shows how you can kind of tease the data in a quasi-experimental approach to look at how much people are benefiting. What are they willing to pay for a ride sharing, for a ride on ride sharing as opposed to a different ride, and compared to the price, you get the difference being the consumer surplus. As Bob knows, when we talk about welfare analysis or the well-being of different markets, we look at, there's a bigger story. It's consumer surplus, tax revenue, and producer surplus makes the total benefits in that demand-supply figure that he showed up there. But then we have a phrase called general equilibrium, which is other markets are affected. And so with the understanding that a lot of what we're going to do up here is kind of what I would call informed conjecture, I'd like to just ask Bob, that negative sign, how much should we worry about that? In the sense that you can imagine a world where consumers are benefiting tremendously from the convenience and the low cost of being able to pull out their phone and grab a ride with Uber and Lyft. But there's got to be some of that is induced new demand. Maybe I wouldn't have traveled that way before. I would have driven my own car. Some of it is I would have taken a taxi. And so if you look at the consumer and producer surplus and the tax revenue from the taxi side, again, informed conjecture, how much should we worry? How much is that substituting away from that?
You don't even mention Metro as an alternative
Metro,
anymore?
yeah. I don't Metro very often, sorry. Yeah, that wouldn't help my question.
So I don't think we know how much is substituting away from it, but my sense is a large portion of that is essentially new benefits. But I would turn the question back to you and say, what's the alternative here? Do we want to try to put the genie back in the bottle? Yeah. So I sort of see two phases of this. One, there's been a steady growth of employment of what Uber likes to call these driver partners. I mentioned the number 500,000. I think that was in 2015. And I think that's a great thing for a variety of reasons. But when we actually move to driverless cars, that stuff's going to evaporate.
Yeah, that was my follow-up question.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, I think we're going to have to think hard about that. But I don't think I want to put the genie back in the bottle.
Yeah. That is, the genie back in the bottle, again, I'll come back to the trade paper, because I think it's illustrative also. There is, if you look at that paper, I think the implications are quite stark of what the labor market effects were. But the question is, what could have we done different, right? So in this example, you have a very large country in China liberalizing, right? There's only so much you can do to prevent that from another country. You can maybe tap the brakes and do some policies. And so I think that leads to some of these policy questions. And in Cliff's framework, maybe that's more of a government failure over response. But I do think, seeing especially what we see with the trade debate now, we have to be at least wary of what that response might be. It could be good. It could be an over response. Cliff, just a follow up on yours. I do want to just ask you. This is the technical question on the instrument, because you said the paper goes into it, and if I can get a couple lines here. This instrument, taxes, work only insofar as the local community instituting this tax is doing so not for economic reasons, and the tax doesn't affect the local economy. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure.
And you think, why would the taxes not? I mean,
It's a very small tax. It's a very small tax.
But enough
It's
to affect congestion.
0.5% of a sales tax. Well, the way we do it is we use the cumulative tax revenue as ultimately our instrument. So at any one time, it's small, and it takes a long time, and that's what we point out in the paper, for this tax revenue to build up, for it to complement federal and state money that they're getting if they oftentimes pass these taxes that could have an effect on congestion. So it's not a question that you really can count on this tax itself to do super big things, because highways are so expensive and the amount of money they're raising is small, but they accumulate enough of it that at some point in the future that actually could have some effect, and especially if it's complementing the state and federal money. Can I make a quick comment, by the way, on this order paper?
Sure.
All right, look, this is
Which
something
one? Your paper?
this is something I said at the very beginning of the presentation, so I just want to at least make it clear why I mentioned this. I noted a distinction between micro policies dealing with efficiencies or government failures and policies dealing with redistribution, okay? So this is just classic, and I just don't understand why. Here, we're really talking about an efficiency phenomenon, a new technology, all right? And I'm going through and I'm presenting results that suggest that we could talk about GDP growth just from this innovation alone that could approach 2%, okay, just from that. And so what happens? Instead of either celebrating that potential phenomena or saying, okay, how can we have this? We turn all of this into a social policy question. What about redistribution of labor, right? And this inevitably happens, right? These are two different things. There is no market failure going on here, right? The fact that labor loses, that happens all the time, right? We have a new product, we have a new innovation, demand shifts, less support for this product, you're going to cut labor. No inefficiency there, all right? It's then something that's turned into a social policy problem, but how many more of these do we have to have, right? We have an infinite number of these, and they almost seem to add as soon as you get an efficiency effect that has any redistribution involved, we have to bring the government in to worry about this social policy problem. Where frankly, my answer is it's completely irrelevant, totally irrelevant. I wouldn't care about it. I don't think we should care about it. But most importantly, this will ultimately be a political decision at the ballot box, and I don't think voters are going to care about it at all. No one is going to get elected thinking about policies to protect people who are going to lose jobs because of the introduction of autonomous vehicles.
All right, can I ask a follow-up question? First of all, I disagree on so many levels. One,
you're a liberal. You're a liberal.
Whatever you may be. Well, most empirically, I disagree with the last one, which is I do think if you talk about truck drivers, taxi drivers, insurance companies, car manufacturers, auto workers, those distribute, whether or not you think that's efficient or not, whether or not that's in your social welfare function, your last line was nobody will care. I have a sneaking suspicion that people care. I mean, we just saw a whole week of, saving 600 jobs or 1,000 jobs from crossing the border. There's something that was a lot of oxygen taken up politically for a little number of jobs, and we're talking quite a bit. I want to get back to just one other part of your paper, which is you have a very nice instrumental variable research design, and as you put in your presentation, there's an assumption of what is the congestion effects of introducing autonomous vehicles.
Yeah.
And I guess I just want to tease that out because what I just heard Bob tell me is, at least on the self-driving part, for now, that is not crowding out other driving so much as it's adding new driving, and people are just taking up this stuff more, which if anything, so you have that, and then you have the countervailing effects that these things operate efficiently, and then they're going to be in algorithms and fewer, all the rest. I understood you used the word assumption very carefully. Any sense of, blind people, I don't know how many blind people are there. Blind people might be driving more. People who don't drive or feel uncomfortable driving might be driving more. I use the word driving, and we need a new word. Self-driving? I don't know. Every time I say driving in this context, I have quotation marks. What's that? Traveling, thank you. Yeah, but you could do, I guess traveling was good. Traveling by vehicle instead of aircraft. Any sense? I mean, how much kind of weight do you want to put on that, or What are the countervail? Give me, I mean, we can't do an estimate here. Give me the pluses and the minuses kind of roughly.
Let me first characterize, though, some of the concerns you have about what autonomous vehicles do. Remember that the problem of congestion is peak period driving, right? So we have, we're looking at different times of day when, we have excess demand on the available capacity, okay? So I'll set aside the fact that the road capacity itself could be increased independent of the vehicle, but the fact that we probably don't need the breakdown lane anymore, we can have narrower lanes, that will help with capacity. But independent of that, think of the kinds of people who will be induced. So what the phenomena you're talking about is called induced driving. So now people who didn't drive during peak or didn't drive at all, because now the cost of driving less or less onerous, might want to drive. My guess is that for non-work trips, the people you're talking about, maybe you're blind or elderly or whatever, probably are going to be going outside the peak. Not necessarily a reason that they have to go peak period, and so that won't necessarily increase a lot of induced demand there. The issue about, though, other people who, let's say, used to take metro and now, the end of that mode could be forthcoming, and they start using their autonomous vehicles. Question there again is their flexibility on work schedules. So if you know now, if you realize, well, I can work in my car, I might adjust my departure time and say, well, I don't have to leave as early as I did. My workday starts the minute I get in my autonomous vehicle, and I'm going to leave a little later, but I'm going to start working away. Or say, look, I'm going to eat breakfast in my car, and that will alter my departure time. So there are those behavioral aspects that could greatly have an effect on how much induced demand there is. But also, let's get back to what I'll keep pushing, the government failure. If one has got a concern about induced demand, we have a policy that actually the congressman has even represented that is there to address it, congestion pricing, right? And it's easier to implement in autonomous vehicles, and it'll certainly contribute to spreading out the peak. So the problem, to the extent that there is going to be one with induced demand, is something that policy can easily address. And I would even suggest that in this environment, it'll probably be easier to address it because a lot of people won't even own cars. And you'll use your autonomous vehicle, and there happens to be a peak toll. It's like when you're in a taxi and have to pay some airport charge or something like that.
Thanks. We do agree on congestion pricing. Emily, I want to turn to Emily and bring her into this conversation. Okay, so right now I live about 10 minutes from here. I've thought about it and concluded it's not worth it for me to not buy a car and instead take a Lyft or an Uber. That calculus presumably would change if they were driving themselves because the cost goes transferably down. Trying to get a sense from a market perspective, and again, a lot of this is just informed conjecture, where is the economics of this heading? Where can you imagine if assuming the technology, who's going to be taking this up generationally, geographically, and we can get into the jobs displacement if you want, but kind of economically, what do you think that means for the industry? I should remind everybody that Emily's chief economist at Ford. So what does that mean for an industry which right now is predicated on me buying my car, as opposed to maybe once they're driving themselves, and again, I'm 10 minutes from work, it's pretty close, and in fact, particularly easy technologically, I live right on Mass Ave, so it's just one straight shot. You could ask why I don't take the bus, but anyway. What are the implications, I think, for the industry on timing of that, to the extent you have any thoughts, and what are the implications for the industry on that?
Sure. Let me take a couple minutes.
Sure, please.
There are a lot of tails to that question.
Yeah.
First, you're absolutely right that the take-up rates are going to vary depending what kind of environment you're living in, right? If you look at where the population of the country is centered, you have a lot of the population living in urban areas. You can just, envision the county map of the election results that we all just, we're staring at the beginning of November, right? Those places that are near urban centers are going to be ones where the autonomous vehicle is going to be an attractive alternative. Parking is relatively expensive. Congestion is relatively worse. We've developed some estimates of the cost of an autonomous vehicle, so taking sort of the driver out of the rideshare equation, And that takes the price down to something that kind of brackets the cost per mile of owning your own personal vehicle. So that says that, for some people it's going to make sense. For some people, just on a cost perspective, it may not make sense, in sort of the forecast horizon that we have. The other thing to remember is it's not just a cost determination. New vehicle buyers are on average, above median income. They're making this choice not just on cost, but also on the convenience of having, their own personal vehicle. And again, that's something that your decision on that may vary depending, where you live. I may be the outlier here. I live, in the suburban areas of Detroit, and for me, it's hard to imagine living, without a vehicle. And I'll break the cardinal rule of social science, right, and use myself as an anecdote here. But, when you think about the number of stops you make on the way home, the way that a lot of us use our vehicles as sort of a mobile storage unit, that makes the supposed convenience of an autonomous vehicle someone like that may not see it, as universally step up from what they have today. So we've definitely thought about the business in a different way with the advent of this technology. And one thing is one that was sort of touched on already, which is we're very used to thinking in terms of unit vehicle sales. Something that we have to think about in this world is to think more in terms of the demand for miles traveled by vehicle. And in that vein, something that's important to remember is the second word of autonomous vehicle is still vehicle. So we're still talking about driving around on something that has, probably 4 wheels and looks like some sort of box.
Maybe not a steering wheel, though.
Maybe not a steering wheel. Well, I think we'll get to that point. So if you think about, let's say, the same or a higher number of miles traveled per vehicle being demanded, you may be spreading that over a larger or smaller vehicle stock. And if you look at Wall Street analyst reports over the past year, you can find estimates ranging from anywhere to a 5% reduction in the vehicles on the road to a 50% reduction in the number of vehicles on the road. Now, the transition in the latter would be a lot more painful than the transition in the former case, but ultimately you get to a vehicle stock that's going to be utilized at a faster or slower rate. So you're going to be turning the vehicles over faster if there are fewer of them. The miles traveled, I would argue, would probably be the same or slightly higher because you're taking something and reducing the cost of it. So, ultimately, I think it's still a very vibrant industry.
Yeah. Okay, just on the last point, and I don't know how much you can speak about this, but the kind of competitive climate right now, and this is sort of I would consider myself an moderately informed observer. You've got the ride-sharing technologies, which are incredibly slick technologies and utilizing right now kind of the gig economy. You have Google, which bought Waze, something that another slick technology. For a techno pessimist, I used all these things. So Cliff could take me to the woodshed on that later. And the whole notion of kind of efficient routing, especially as you get into carpooling and how you pick everybody up, which I assume is much more complex in a self-driving car. And then you have the manufacturers. And so the easy question is like, who wins? That's kind of an unfair question, but is there, and certainly you guys are planning this, is there a model of the future where it's like, one, you guys are providing products for a supplier that's essentially a fleet, or is it sort of what we have now, just more of it, just, it's not even individuals in rural parts buying their cars, but in urban parts relying on Uber. Again, maybe I'm not sure how detailed you can go on that. Any conjecture on what that looks like and how kind of I read a quote recently that I think it was the CEO of Uber said getting the technology right for self-driving cars was existential for them. Is there an existential question for Ford in this?
I suppose. I don't think we'd put it that way, but I think to maybe get, technical in terms of what we've said publicly on the way we think this evolves. We do think that the ramp up to autonomous vehicles does likely start with a fleet sort of application. So we would be selling, the vehicles to someone who would be operating them in some sort of a ride sharing or a ride hailing capacity. That's a first step. The adoption curve for the customers is going to depend on both the cost and, as I said, how customers decide they want to use this technology to make their lives better. So that's probably all I want to say on the business model.
Fair enough. Let me just turn to Ken. As I mentioned before, he directs the Intelligent Transportation Systems Joint Program Office at DOT. So I'd like to kind of draw you in on a couple things. One is maybe give a little bit of what your office is about and the role that it plays in all these technologies and in the research side. And two, I want you to distinguish a little bit. There are different technologies out there. So imagine a world at some point, you can project if you want when this world happens, of self-driving cars. What is the role, if any, of self-driving vehicles and something that your office is focused on, vehicle-to-vehicle communication? How important it is from a safety standpoint, that these vehicles talk to each other, especially if you want to get the deep penetration that Cliff alluded to, about 50%.
Well, in the Joint Program Office, we have a pretty broad portfolio. So you mentioned the Connected Vehicle Program.
Yeah.
And we actually do have a rulemaking that's pending to allow that technology to kind of be universally available. We've worked with the automotive manufacturers. We've demonstrated it in Ann Arbor, where we had 8 manufacturers who built the equipment in. And it's a simple technology using Wi-Fi that allows the cars to talk to each other, and the operator gives the operator a greater chance of avoiding collisions. And we think that technology alone has the potential to eliminate 80% of the unimpaired collisions.
80%, say it again?
80% of the unimpaired collisions. Not all collisions are from unimpaired drivers, though. 30 to 40% are impaired drivers. Now, I do think there's a space where self-driving vehicles may be able to help more with those impaired vehicles. Getting people who maybe are inebriated out from behind the driver wheel and into the back seat in a self-driving car is going to be a safer scenario than having somebody drive in a condition that they should. You also mentioned people, for example, who how many blind people there are, how many people might be able to gain access. I think that's an area where the self-driving capabilities are really going to increase the number of miles that are driven. I did some very quick back-of-the-envelope calculations about the number of people collecting Social Security disability benefits who said that transportation is their single obstacle to whether or not they can get a job.
Sure.
And there's probably $300 million a year spent in benefits to that population. So if self-driving becomes an option for those people, and it won't necessarily for the whole group of them, but there's a group of people who can go from receiving benefits to earning income and paying taxes. And so those kind of mobility benefits for people who would like to work, but transportation is the barrier, is a great benefit. But in our Joint Program Office, we're working on these connected vehicles, which we see evolving and being a critical component of autonomy or of automated vehicles. We don't really think of them as autonomous because of taking the technology to scale. If you want to see the safety benefits, if you want to see the mobility benefits that can come from self-driving technologies, you're going to have that collision avoidance technology, which comes from low latency communications and other communications as well. And then we really won't have time to get into the whole smart cities concept and some of that, but we're also doing some work in connected and autonomous vehicles with a grant we've put out to Columbus. So.
I just want to ask you to make one projection, so forgive me. So we've seen over decades a pretty steady decline in traffic accidents and traffic fatalities per mile driven. I think in the last few years we've seen an uptick. This gets back to being the father of an adolescent. That uptick, I think, is due to texting, which is something in my household, incessant texting. Everything you're just talking about now, induced demand, lots of benefits for people who are impeded now because they don't have access to transportation, presumably a lot more driving going on. With the technology, whenever it comes to fruition, do you see that trend, that long-term trend, going down, meaning it's safer to be on the road 20 years from now than it is now?
I think that's one of the things that we have to pay particular attention to, not just in government, but in the industry that's developing the technologies in the cars. If you look at what the fatality rates were on America's highways 40 years ago, if we had that same fatality rate, we'd be losing 150,000 people a year on American roadways. Right now, that number has gone up about almost 10% to 35,000, and we were on a 10-year decline. There are a number of factors, distraction in particular, but also pedestrian, and I think some of this is distracted pedestrian.
Sure.
So I think that's an issue we're going to have to deal with. I think technology helps us bring about the kind of safety benefits. I think it would be tragic if we introduce automated vehicles and don't use that as an opportunity to bring down the fatality rates at the same time, while making sure that we increase the mobility options for people. I think we can do both if we're thoughtful in how we introduce the technology.
We have time for questions from the crowd, so if you have a question, I ask that you, first of all, raise your hand, wait for the microphone, state who you are, and make it a question, a nice, short, concise question. Back right there.
Yes, John Manzolillo from the CEP Group. And this is open question to the panel. Have any of you looked at specifically the area of autonomous vehicles in the logistics sector?
Logistics sector, I think he was.
Trucking.
You mean freight
trucking.
delivery? Well, we know that there's a lot of work ongoing. Many of you may have seen the auto truck demonstration recently where they did an automated vehicle making a delivery. The technology, I think there's tremendous potential benefits in that sector for autonomy, and particularly if you can shift some freight and logistics deliveries to nighttime, which would be easier to do with automation. It also potentially addresses driver shortage issues. But I do think eventually we do have to deal with some of the disruptive aspects in the labor markets. I mean, we'll have to deal with them as a society one way or another, whether it's a government activity or whether we just recognize that that's part of what happens out of technology change. But I think logistics, freight in particular, is a tremendous opportunity for self-driving.
And presumably that's where you would, I guess, see this technology in the earlier stages, right? Dedicated lanes, trucks on highways seems a lot easier technologically than lots of individual cars in the road in the middle of a city.
It's always a debate as to which sector is going to.
Yeah.
I think the economics favor the commercial sector.
Thank you very much. I'm June O'Connell, and I'd like to, the focus is often on large cities, but I want to ask you all, particularly Emily and Bob, about studying the impact of driverless cars and the shared economy in places like Bend, Oregon, or Florence, Oregon, not Portland, Marinette, Menominee in Michigan, Green Bay area of Wisconsin. All are places in which if you cannot drive a car, you are hosed because taxi cabs cost more there than here. And so I guess I'm saying, what about the non-big cities? How do you see Uber and shared vehicles playing out in those places?
Emily, do you want to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to take a start at that. I think, first of all, from our perspective, we serve a wide spectrum of customers, and so it's very important for us to think about the transportation network, not just in an urban context. That said, I think when you look at the business case for a service provider, as well as the use case for customers, in less densely populated areas, those calculations look very different. So you might be able to have a ride-sharing service either with or without a driver, but you would have to have customers that were willing to tolerate, for example, a longer wait time, for that ride to come and get them. If your alternative is having your own car parked in the driveway, that may not be tolerable. If your alternative is that you're not able to drive and you don't otherwise have access to transportation, then that might be a perfectly attractive alternative. So I think there are lots of applications for all the technologies we're talking about, not just autonomous vehicles, that will affect non-urban areas. But that model, will look a little bit different than the one that we typically hear talked about.
And Bob, remind us again, you looked at 4 cities. I guess the question is, Uber's in smaller markets as well. You could replicate the result for smaller markets as well.
Yeah, so you could replicate it, but I think the point you make is a good one, that these technologies lend themselves to scale economies, or there are scale economies associated with these technologies, so it's going to take longer to get to, I think you used Bend, Oregon as an example, and to Emily's point, it may not be quite the same level of service.
Bob, I don't know if you know the answer to this. It's a question I have on the surge pricing. So one could design a surge pricing algorithm such that I never have to wait more than X minutes for a vehicle, right? Because if it's, let's say 5 minutes, because if it's 10 minutes, they could just up the surge and bring on supply and bring down quantity demanded, and it doesn't, and maybe this gets into kind of equity efficiency trade-offs or perceptual issues. It doesn't quite seem that that's how it's designed. Do you have any insights into
I don't
that?
know the details of the surge pricing algorithm,
Yeah.
but just from, and there may be people here from ride-sharing platforms who can shed some light on that. But in talking to people and asking them about wait times, because this was a part of our paper,
Yeah.
they do try to develop the algorithm with a certain expected wait time.
I see, okay. Right here, middle row, like 4 or 5 back.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for your talk. My name is Truman. Just interested in what you're talking about. I have a question about making transportation policy and infrastructure projects for the short and middle term. I'm making a couple assumptions. One, that we don't know exactly how long it'll be between now and when we have a world in which 50% of cars are driverless. And 2, that we'll need to make different policies for a world in which 50% of cars are driverless and have different kinds of infrastructure projects. So I'm just wondering, in the short term, since there's a lot of talk about infrastructure spending, especially with the new administration, how do we think about gearing that policy towards our like interests now, in the middle, and long term?
I think, well, Cliff already started with congestion pricing, but Cliff, do you have any other thoughts?
Well, again, there's the normative and the positive is what we ought to do, what is. I mean, again, just to reinforce what I was talking about, I've pretty much written that off as serious, constructive conversation that government really is going to think seriously about constructive policies. I mean, the track record is clear, the status quo bias is understood. So, I think, we can talk about congestion pricing, we can talk about axle weight pricing for trucks, we could talk about improving the efficiency of highway design, we could look about, how can we reduce production costs and building things, transit, all the sort of inefficiencies there. We can talk about maybe we should get rid of weight-based landing fees at airports, so private planes who pay nothing, coming in, forget it. I mean, there's this huge list of things, and it's, I don't know, again, you're probably too young, but there's a New Yorker cartoon, and you see somebody saying things like this, pricing, production, whatever, and there's a dog, and it's what you say and what the dog hears. And so you say all these things, and all the dog hears is ruff, ruff, ruff. And, we've been saying this forever, what should be done, even short-term or medium-term, and, you have to look at the observed responses. It's, we have ways of doing things, and that's how we're going to continue to do them.
Okay.
I think something that would be really helpful in that context, and you guys have made great progress on this, is to have a unified national framework when we think about how these vehicles are going to be rolled out and used, and that'll give everyone sort of an understanding of where they're starting from and where they're trying to get to. I think that's probably a really good first step to the issues that you're talking about.
And specifically, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration just put out a policy document on automated vehicles and is soliciting public comment on it. And I think it's just the start of, we want to encourage the technology, but at the same time, we want to make sure that it's rolled out safely, but we don't want to stifle innovation in the field.
Bob, did you have a comment?
So I have a slightly different take on this than Cliff does. I think ideas do matter. And yes, it's sometimes feeling like we're talking to the dog and we're going rough, rough, rough. But, you know, if you look at a place like San Francisco, for example, now versus 30 years ago, where just my sense is that congestion is a lot worse. They don't have a lot of room to build more roads. I think they're going to be thinking about things like congestion pricing at some point. Can I say when? I have no idea, but I think they will think about it.
Okay, one unscientific exit question for everybody. I talked about my adolescent son to start. I have a 5-year-old. Is he going to learn how to drive a car? What do you think? Bob, go ahead. Give me an answer.
Sorry, Ted. It's
You don't have
above
no
my pay
answer?
grade.
You think he'll be driving a car?
5-year, oh, yeah, oh, no. I mean, I defer to the industry, but everyone who I've heard talk about this in the private sector is saying, you know, this is going to be sooner rather than later.
Okay.
And what
And he
you're
lives in the
also
city,
encouraging
10 minutes from school.
encouraging all the things that you see, you know, every other day there's a new development, and we now hear Apple has expressed an interest in autonomous cars.
Yeah.
I don't know how excited Ford is to
Yeah.
have Apple join in. I mean, I think you know the rate of knowledge and you know all the resources going in from this huge sector into this suggests that we're going to see this sooner rather than later.
Emily?
Well, again, I think it does depend a lot where he decides to settle,
Yeah.
where his first job may be, but.
I mean, not in my basement. We can all agree on that.
Very short from there. You know, we've talked about 2030 as under what we would consider sort of a moderate adoption scenario for autonomous vehicles.
Yeah.
And in that scenario, we've talked about up to 10% of miles traveled, up to 20% of vehicle sales being autonomous. So that means there are still a lot of people, may or may not be your son, but a lot of people who will still need to know how to drive a car.
And I would agree. I think he probably will learn to drive a car, but certainly not necessarily at the age of 16 or 17 living in the city.
Yeah.
It may be when he goes to school or finds himself in a situation because he's living in that.
Great. Okay, and with that, please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you, everybody.